All right, I see the little dots that everybody's connecting to audio, so I think we are in good shape. Good evening, everyone. My name is Ginny. I work for Anderson's Bookshops, and I'm very glad to have you with us this evening. We are joined by author Scott Anderson. No relation to the store, though of course we approve of the name. But I'll let him talk a little bit in a couple of minutes here, but I just wanted to take a moment to say thank you very much for being with us this evening, for your support of Anderson's Bookshops. Especially during these times, but really always, we appreciate your support. We are a local independent bookstore. We've been run and owned by the Anderson family for going on 6 generations, and we take it all very personally. Your support matters quite a bit to us. So we just want to take a moment and say thank you, that your support in any form really means a lot to us. So thank you for that. And we are shifting into the virtual world as everyone is here. Normally, we would be very glad to see you all in person in our store, but of course, we're doing this online now to keep everybody safe. So this is a new platform and a new world for all of us, but we are doing a bunch more of these. So there's a couple other things coming up I just want to let you know about. They're all listed on our website, but a couple other just fun events. We have 4 thriller authors on the 15th of September, and then we have Rob Bell, who is a writer and thinker, on the 21st. And then another really great nonfiction, Reed Forgrave, is coming on the 23rd. That he did a book called Love, Zach, about a football player in Iowa who ended up taking his own life, but looks very, very scrupulously at youth football and what that means and what we've allowed as all culture and all of those stories that go with it. So some other great things coming up. Please join us if something else strikes your fancy. But this evening, we're very glad to have Scott Anderson with us for his new book, The Quiet Americans, for CIA Spies at the Dawn of the Cold War, A Tragedy in 3 Acts, which is one of my favorite subtitles, I have to say. It's very, I just love it. It's full of grandeur. And Scott, of course, is a best-selling author of Lawrence in Arabia, and has done all of this research in just such a relatable, quite compulsively readable story about these factors and after World War II and the Cold War, and I just can't wait to hear more about it. So without further ado, Scott, take it away.
All right. Thank you, Jenny. Thanks so much. And thank you all for coming in tonight. Well, I guess I'll start by just talking about how I came to write this book. I grew up in East Asia. My father was an agricultural advisor for the American government. And so I grew up in Taiwan and Korea and Indonesia. And this was in the 1960s when all these countries were so-called frontline states in the war against international anti-communism. In fact, my elementary school in Taiwan, in the entranceway to my elementary school, there was this massive mounted anti-aircraft gun that was manned around the clock by 2 Republic of Taiwanese soldiers with binoculars, constantly scanning the skies for incoming squadrons of red Chinese airplanes. So I grew up with this very kind of maybe a heightened sense of the Cold War and this idea that real war could break out at any time. Over the years, I've always wanted to go back and explore the Cold War in writing. And in starting to do a little bit of research, what occurred to me was that there was this really pivotal time. And it's the time I cover in The Quiet Americans, from essentially about 1944, the last days of World War II, to the Hungarian Revolution in 1956. So this 12-year period where so much of what was to come in the Cold War, it all kind of started there. Everything became entrenched at that time. So I really wanted to kind of focus in on this period. Just to give you just a broad overview of the kind of changes I'm talking about. In 1944, FDR, of course, was still alive. And all through World War II, he had been talking about how this war was going to be the end of empire. That with the war over, this was going to be the dismantling of the European empires, specifically the British and the French, that they were causing such disenchantment and revolt throughout the Third World. And America was going to be this herald of democracy around the world. These were 2 things that FDR talked about over and over again. And of course, he died in April of 1945, and his dream was never realized. But then you get to 1956, just 11, 12 years later. And instead of dismantling the European empires, the United States is actually bankrolling them, both the British and the French in Asia, in Africa. And now America is actually overthrowing democratic regimes in places like Iran and Guatemala. So I was fascinated by that period, and like essentially what happened? How did this grand American dream and vision, go so south so quickly? But in deciding to write about that period, the kind of history I've always been drawn to and that I like to write is about people at the front line of events. It's not generals or diplomats sitting behind desks. It's actually people like in the field that are affecting change and being directly influenced by what's happening around them. And as I was thinking about the Cold War, I was thinking, well, who are the people on the front lines of the Cold War? And of course, it was spies. It was spies of both sides, the United States and the Soviet Union. They were the ones in this very entrenched and static, if you want to call it, a battlefield. They were the ones constantly vying for advantage across both lines, which I kind of I kind of thought, well, that's pretty lucky because everyone likes to read about spies and they're actually pretty fun to write about too. So in The Quiet Americans, I really focus in on four men. And unfortunately, it's men. I would have loved to have found a woman character to follow, but in the 1940s and 1950s with the CIA, everybody was in the field were men. I'm not going to describe all four in any detail. I think it's kind of hard to wrap your head around in a short time. I'll just briefly mention two, and then go into a bit more detail on the other two. One of the four was a man named Frank Wisner. And Wisner, the fascinating thing with Wisner is he was working for the Office of Strategic Services during the war. That was OSS was the precursor to the CIA during World War II. He happened to be on a mission in Romania in the summer of 1944. So this is still a full year before World War II is over. And he was on the ground, really the first American on the ground to see what was happening in a Eastern European country as the Soviet Red Army rolled in. And basically what the Soviets did is very, very quickly took over the country, took over the government, and imposed their will on the place. So Wisner, from that time, and then he later saw it happening in Eastern Germany at the end of the war, he was kind of a canary in the coal mine. He was constantly writing back to Washington, to the OSS headquarters, saying, hey, they're violently taking over this country. No one wanted to hear it back in Washington because, of course, the Americans and the Soviets are still wartime allies. After the war, he actually was a Wall Street lawyer before the war. He briefly went back to his law firm and then became the head of what was called the Office of Policy Coordination, which was the covert operations wing of the CIA. And so the OPC, the Office of Policy Coordination, was so secret that even the name was classified for 25 years. As the head of OPC, Wisner oversaw what he called the Mighty Wurlitzer. And it was these covert operations that were taking place all around the world, on 6 continents around the world, 5 continents. Supposedly they weren't happening in the United States, but in fact they were, so 6 continents. The second character in the book is a man named Edward Lansdale. He was an ad executive in San Francisco. At the end of World War II, he's sent to the Philippines. And the Philippines at the time was ruled by this very corrupt oligarchy. It had been an American, we didn't call it a colony, but it was for the previous 50 years. And now, immediately after World War II, there's this beginning of this communist insurgency. And coming from an ad man's background, Lansdale has had this very simple idea that the way you defeat communism is you have to give the local people that have been disenfranchised, you have to give them a stake in the government, you have to give them a stake in the system. And so he set about in the Philippines, and he literally, it was him and two assistants to try to defeat this communist insurgency and to promote a kind of a responsible and a decent man to run the country, and he succeeded. And it was one of the great sort of success stories from the American vantage point of defeating communism in the Philippines. And he came back to Washington in 1954, and he met with the director of the CIA. And the director, this is right when things are starting to percolate in Vietnam. The French are getting kicked out. So Lansdale is sent to Vietnam, and this great line is saying, "Go to Vietnam and do the same thing there that you did in the Philippines." So Lansdale goes, and he actually kind of came somewhat close to pulling it off. He again cozied up to a local leader who he felt could carry Vietnam into a more democratic way. The amazing thing is when he arrived in Vietnam in 1954, his unit was called the Saigon Military Mission, and it was him and 12 other men. That was it. That was the American military presence in Vietnam in 1954. And of course, got away from him, and the 12 men were subsequently followed by almost 3 million more. So I'm going to talk a little bit more detail about the two other men in my book. One is this man named Michael Burke. And to try to describe Michael Burke, I'm going to read one paragraph from my book, and I promise it'll be the only thing that I read tonight. But it's just, I think it gets across this idea of who Michael Burke was better than I can do kind of on my feet. Many people have exciting and varied lives. And then there was Edmund Michael Burke, star athlete, Black Ops commando, Hollywood screenwriter, ladies' man, spy. Some of the other highlights of his diverse resume: maritime insurance investigator, baseball team president, media executive, circus manager. On a personal level, friends with Ava Gardner, Muhammad Ali, and Eleanor Roosevelt. Drinking buddy of Ernest Hemingway, Gary Cooper, and Mickey Mantle. During one particularly hectic stretch in his spying days, his social circle included a lively group of aspiring filmmakers and an even livelier group of aspiring paramilitary assassins. And such were the demands of his profession that he often had to entertain both in the same day. Charismatic, suave, and possessive Black Irish good looks, in essence, Michael Burke was James Bond before James Bond existed. Michael Burke really does feel like he was like just stepped out of a kind of implausible spy movie. Incredibly handsome and incredibly charming. His life was marked by just these incredible highs and lows. Right after World War II, he went out to he was broke. He was another war vet looking for a job. He ends up going out to Hollywood, and this is where he was hanging out with Gary Cooper. He's a consultant on a movie, and then, as what often happens with people who go to Hollywood, everything fell apart. He comes back to New York. He wants to be a writer, and classic writer in New York story. He immediately becomes impoverished, and at this point, he has a wife and a young daughter, and things are really quite desperate. It's so desperate that at one point his daughter's stroller is stolen, and Burke doesn't have the money to buy her a new stroller, so they have to carry her around the streets of New York everywhere. He gets this call out of the blue in 1949, and these men who won't identify who they're with, but they want to meet with him and talk over a possibility of a job. And these men are from the Office of Policy Coordination. So Burke meets with them at the Algonquin Hotel in New York. And after a bunch of chit chat and many drinks, they say to him, "So what do you know about Albania?" And Burke doesn't know anything about Albania. But at the time, Albania, it's right above Greece in southeastern Europe, and it was a communist dictatorship. And maybe the one country in Eastern Europe that there was the greatest chance that it might be able to be peeled away from the Soviet bloc, the really despotic leader. But of course, Burke doesn't come out and say he doesn't know anything about Albania. He kind of hems and haws, and finally the men say, "We want you to go start a revolution there." And Burke, who again is completely broke at this point, basically says, "Sure." So most of the idea is that he's going to be overseeing dropping anti-communist partisans behind the lines into Albania, and the refugee population of Albania is almost all in Italy. So Burke and his family go to Rome, and there's this great detail in the book where he's thinking about like what kind of cover story he can have, and because he's not going to have a regular job. He's going to be throwing around a lot of money. And so he thinks, well, what kind of job can I have where I don't really do much, but I'm kind of hanging out in cafes all day and throwing around a lot of money. And so it comes to him, well, film producer. So he goes to Rome masquerading as a film producer. And then that's the part that I read from, where during the day he's hanging out with the Italian film directors and actors, and at night he's sneaking away to meet with his Albanian co-conspirators. And at one point he becomes nervous that this attempted coup in Albania is taking a lot of time. He's worried that people are going to start asking questions of like, well, what are you actually doing here? You're not producing anything. But what he discovered is that the film people in Italy, very much like the film people in Hollywood, were so self-absorbed. All they wanted to do was talk about themselves. They never asked him a question of what he was doing. Ultimately, Burke was promoted to running these paramilitary airdrop and infiltration operations throughout Eastern Europe. He moved to Germany, and almost all these operations were just total disasters. The KGB knew these guys were coming probably from the moment the planes took off. And so it's just uniformly disastrous throughout Eastern Europe. Hundreds of these partisans just disappeared or were executed. So finally, Burke just loses heart, and he quits the CIA in 1954 to join Barnum and Bailey's circus as their manager. And I talk about the incredible highs and lows of Burke's life. It's not completely his fault, but basically within 2 years, he'd kind of run Barnum and Bailey's circus into the ground. He then has a meeting with an executive at CBS. At this meeting, he just kind of candidly admits, he says, I should tell you, I know absolutely nothing about television, and gets the job on the spot as a senior executive. He's with CBS for years. He ends up moving CBS into sports. They take over the New York Yankees. He becomes the president of the New York Yankee franchise. Immediately, the Yankees have the worst losing streak in New York Yankees history. So he's just this kind of wonderful character. So I'm going to talk about the last person in the book. His name is Peter Sichel, and Peter was really kind of my proverbial, finding the chest of letters in an attic somewhere. Peter is still alive. He's 97 years old, about to turn 98, sharp as a tack. And even better, agreed to a series of interviews with me. He's the last surviving member of that generation of CIA agents who were operating in the early Cold War by about a 10-year span. Peter was, during World War II, he was also in the Office of Strategic Services. He had this fascinating job where he was a black market currency trader. One thing I had never really thought about before, but OSS is dropping a lot of people behind the Nazi lines as commandos or spies. And one thing, either if you're a commando or a spy and you're operating in enemy territory, you need the currency that people are using at the time. You need it to recruit people, just to buy stuff. And so all through World War II, on both sides, there was this tremendous black market currency trading that was going on. And Peter would go out. He had a Jeep and a safe in back, within this safe full of gold and English pounds, US dollars. And he would be meeting with black marketeers and buying the currency that he needed to put people behind enemy lines. And he was so good at his job. In one case, he was in Algiers, and he collected 80 million French francs. But he also managed to buy, for his personal consumption, an entire wine cellar stocked with wine and brandy. Peter, at the end of the war, he was because one of the few people kept on. There was this massive demobilization of the American military, including of the OSS, when the war ended. Peter was kept on, and he became the first, what was to become the CIA. It wasn't called the CIA at the time, but the head of the first covert operations unit of the American intelligence in Berlin. And Berlin already, by the end of World War II, is the new ground zero of the coming Cold War. And just to give an indication of just how kind of clueless of the Americans were of this coming new conflict, in Berlin at the time, there were certainly hundreds, if not thousands, of Soviet intelligence officers operating. The unit Peter headed up consisted of 9 men, including himself, and he had just turned 24. So Peter stayed in Berlin through 1952, and had, if anyone's ever seen the movie The Third Man, it's about Vienna, but it's about post-war Vienna, but Berlin was very much like that, right? Just this den of thieves, den of spies, and Peter basically just had to learn by mistakes. And one of the great mistakes he made in 1946, the Americans, President Truman wanted to find out what the Soviets were up to in Eastern Germany. So Peter had these called chains of spies and agents running all through Eastern Germany, all being coordinated through former German military intelligence officers. And Peter told me that he was getting very nervous about how long these chains were getting, and that agents had groups of sub-agents, and it ended up being probably between 250 and 300 agents out in the field, and they all disappeared overnight. One guy was arrested, one top agent, and then within 24-48 hours, all the chains disappeared. They all got picked up by the KGB, and it was to Peter, it was the first indication of just how outsmarted and outflanked they were by the Soviets. And then all through this period in Berlin, there's just these incredible spy stories where at a certain point, they're running a Soviet double agent who is running this very complicated sting operation. And this double agent is entrapping people, and they're disappearing into the Soviet Gulag, or they're being executed. But Peter and his team need to protect this guy, because he's also their main conduit for information of what the Soviets are doing on the east side of Berlin, to the point where Peter and his men are protecting this guy against the American military occupation authorities who are trying to capture him. So he ends up playing this cat and mouse game, even with another branch of the American government. The amazing thing with Peter, because of his position in Berlin and these operations, these infiltration operations that were going into Eastern Europe that Michael Burke was in charge of, they were such uniformly disastrous that Peter started shutting them down. It was like, we're just losing so many people. So CIA agents, CIA officers would be coming to him saying, hey, I have this operation I'm trying to slip seven people into Czechoslovakia, and here's how we're going to do it. And Peter would veto it. He'd say, no, it's going to be a disaster. And he started vetoing so many operations that the great irony is that the field agents started complaining to headquarters about, why is Peter Sichel canceling all these operations, to the point where Peter came under suspicion as a KGB spy. It was KGB double agent. And he was investigated by the FBI. And of course, there was nothing to it. And kind of the coda to Peter's story, he's back in Washington for a few years at headquarters, and at a very high ranking. He ends up going out to Hong Kong as the CIA station chief there. And he's there in 1960, and he goes to a meeting of the regional CIA station chiefs in Manila in the summer of 1960. And the deputy director of the CIA, new guy, comes out, and he's unveiling this new operation the CIA is going to carry out in mainland China, in Mao's China. and they're going to spend $100 million dropping anti-communist Chinese partisans, behind the front lines, into China to foment revolution and hopefully to overthrow Mao. And Peter takes the deputy director of the CIA aside during a break in this conference, and he says, we would save so much time and money if we just killed them ourselves. This is going to be a fiasco like it was all over Eastern Europe. And then he says, I'm out, I'm done, I quit. So he quit. His family, he was originally from Germany, and his family, going back 5 generations, they're German Jews, were wine distributors. And so the Sichel and Brothers wine company had been going on all these years. When Peter left the CIA, he went back to head up the Sichel and Brothers wine company. And their greatest success for people who, I didn't even know this wine's still around, but it might be, but people who are older will remember this. Their great success was Blue Nun, which was this kind of awful white wine. And I got to know Peter quite well. And at one point, I said to him, I said, Peter, okay, I can understand that you're working with the CIA, you at times you work with old Nazis. Okay, it was strange times, and you're plotting assassination of foreign leaders. Okay, but I said, but come on, Blue Nun, and Peter kind of chuckled, and he has this wonderful kind of mid-European, half European, half English accent, and he said, well, Scott, the old saying that every nation gets the government it deserves. Well, every nation gets the wine it deserves too. So I just thought it was very funny. Then just to end with this for the moment, before we go to questions, I was, Peter had this great line of describing his time in the CIA, and he said, we thought we were the good guys. So it was very simple. We were the good guys. We were fighting the bad guys, and we were going to save the world. And and it was a crusade. It was a romantic crusade. And he said, and what we forgot was that all crusades end badly. So, so that's a little bit about the Quiet Americans.
All right. Sorry, it takes me a second to jump back in there.
That's all right.
Technology doesn't always work. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. That was really fascinating. I will just read a comment here. Paula says, Blue Nun, yes, sadly, I have drank it. I feel like that must have started, been part of the trend of like crazy wine and beer names that is a thing now,
Right.
Blue Nun, what a name.
Yeah.
So folks, if you have questions, please feel free to type them into the chat here, and then I'll relay them to Scott. We do have a couple here from Fred, who asks, how did you gather the information about this book? And how did you pick these specific men to write about?
Great question. I'll start with the second question first. Once I came up with the idea that I wanted to focus on this 12-year period, I had certain parameters of the people I wanted to focus in on. And it was, number one, that they were doing cool stuff around the world. I also wanted a kind of a geographic dispersion. I knew I needed somebody who'd operated primarily in Asia. Frank Wisner I had known about, and because he was at headquarters, he kind of acts as he's kind of the grand bandmaster, so he had a view on everything in the world. But so I probably started out looking at, I probably went through about 20, 25 people that I initially looked at. And what would happen again and again and again is that people, fascinating 3 or 4 years, and then they'd go off and join the State Department and would be stamping visas in Paris or something. Or they had left very little of a paper trail behind them. They didn't have personal correspondence, or they were in positions where if they were real field operatives, they didn't leave papers behind. so weirdly enough, I thought I would end up with a pool of, I don't know, 8 or 9 to kind of choose from, and I ended up with 4. There's no fifth person I could have gone to with this book. With this book, it was these four men. And as far as how I gathered the material, again, I chose them all because I found that there was a certain paper trail to them. I went through lots of government documents. And one thing let's talk about Michael Burke. It's kind of a classic case where, so if you've been in the CIA, if you write anything, if you write a book, it has to go in front of what's called the CIA Review Board. And they can, anything on the grounds of national security or potentially exposing confidential sources, they will excise, they'll censor. And so Michael Burke's book, when it was actually published, the CIA had completely gutted the section of his book that talked about his time in the agency, just completely took it out. But the remarkable thing is I was meeting with someone in the agency, and he said, yeah, no, the review board just ruined his book. But I happen to know that if you go to his papers at Boston University, there's an uncensored copy. There's the raw manuscript, the uncensored version is there. So I scurried up to Boston, and sure enough, there was the manuscript. And I'll just tell one story that was in that manuscript. And this, to me, this is the insidiousness of any kind of censorship. I mean, I can understand if to withhold names of people that could be in danger or whatever. But Burke, in the uncensored version, tells this amazing story where it's in 1954, and he's in Berlin, and he meets with John Foster Dulles, who was the Secretary of State under Eisenhower. And the year prior, in 1953, there had been these spontaneous anti-communist protests in Berlin, in East Berlin, that the Soviets and the East German army had just put down with. They just machine gunned people in the streets, and some 100-odd people were killed in this one day. So Burke meets with John Foster Dulles, and Dulles says, I'd like you to create a disturbance in East Berlin. And Burke goes, what kind of disturbance? And he goes, well, kind of like what happened last year. So here you have a Secretary of State advocating to create a situation where he knows people are going to be killed. And Burke asks Dulles, says, well, okay, you know it's going to fail. What is our purpose in doing this? And Dulles says, well, it'll embarrass the Soviets. So he's willing to just see a lot of people die as a way just to kind of embarrass the Soviets. And Burke managed to just kind of play beat the clock. And Dulles was there for a conference. He had to leave. And so he just managed to kind of do nothing until Dulles had left town. But this obviously fed to his disillusionment with the agency and with the American government. The point of that story is there is absolutely no mention of that story in Burke's published book. The only place that story exists is in his rough manuscript at Boston University. And I've always thought about that story. It's like, on what grounds does the agency withhold that story? That's not national security. This is a story. This is something that happened almost 70 years ago. So all you're really doing is somehow trying to protect the reputation of the Secretary of State, who was kind of a scoundrel anyway. So this is the problem. Under the rubric of national security, stuff is being withheld all the time that has nothing to do with it. So.
Right. Gosh, it's amazing that story exists, though.
Yeah,
you could find it that way.
In only one place in the world does it exist.
Right. Now, did your book have to go through any review? Okay, I didn't think so.
No, it did not. No, I have no connection with the agency, so I didn't have to.
Okay. And now Leslie asked a question that I was thinking as well: is did the CIA learn anything from these fiascos? And I would say, both right away after them and modern day CIA. What do you think? How has that shaped what we have now?
No. The short answer is no. It is astonishing when you look at how disastrous, say, the infiltration operations into Eastern Europe were. And they just kept doing them and doing them and doing them. And there's an amazing, well, the kind of highlight of that period was in Poland. Immediately after World War II in Poland, this Polish anti-communist resistance army really had started up. At one time, it was about 30,000 fighters. And by 1948 or 1947 even, it had been completely crushed by the Soviet Red Army and it disappeared. But in 1949, word filtered out of Poland that in fact it still existed. And not 30,000 fighters anymore, but a few hundred, and that they were taking the fight to the Soviets, and they were actually carrying out a number of military operations and doing very well. This became a major CIA operation to drop Polish anti-communist partisans into this group operating in Poland, sending in weapons, sending in money. As it turned out, 2 years later, but in 1952, the entire thing was a hoax from the get-go, from 1949. It had been destroyed in 1947. This was a Soviet sting operation that operated for 3 years. And they had just been dropping these agents and money and weapons right into the hands of the KGB. And right when Eisenhower was coming into office in 1952, they kind of gleefully came out with this announcement that, we've just been stinging you people for the last 3 years. With individual agents, like with Burke, like with Peter Sichel, this had a huge influence. It's like if this operation had to have involved hundreds, if not thousands of people to get away with it, this scam. And we never saw it coming. So given they were able to pull that off, how do we ever hope to be successful in operations behind the Iron Curtain? So that individual agents, officers, that fueled their disenchantment. But as an institution, no, the operations kept going, even after the fiasco in Poland, to the point where I was talking about with the operation in China. That operation in China did go forward in the early 1960s. And those hundreds of men who were dropped into mainland China, they all disappeared. So no, I don't think, certainly in that way, they didn't learn at all. And one thing, to the second part of the question of have they learned anything today, I feel that there's a tendency, and not just of the CIA, and maybe it's something about just institutions in general. It's the old cliche that they're, generals constantly fighting the last war. So they're constantly, if they learn anything, it's the last lesson to be learned. But the one coming always catches them off guard. Classic. I mean, the one we've all lived with is September 11th. Essentially September 11th was done with butter knives. With X-acto blades. It was the most low tech, but incredibly ingenious operation. We've spent trillions and trillions of dollars since then in building up security in this country. But if there's ever another attack in the United States on this kind of scale of September 11th, it will be something else like that the agency and the FBI have not conceived of, and it will be low tech, and it'll sneak under the radar.
Okay. Leslie said the Polish army sting sounds a bit like today's Russian misinformation campaign.
Yeah. They're very, very good at it. The Russians have been doing this forever. I mean, it goes back to the czars. They're very, very good at it.
Let's see. So I was curious then, how do you think with all of these fiascos, which some of which were more public than others, do you feel like that has impacted our current international standing?
Well,
how they saw our CIA and.
I think specifically to the CIA, how it's impacted the CIA is ever since September 11th, the CIA, as the American diplomatic community in general and throughout the world, they're now kind of living inside bunkers. I remember a few years ago, I was in Sudan, and I had an interview with somebody in the American embassy in Khartoum in Sudan. And the entire building was wrapped in wire mesh to prevent a grenade attack. The staff lived on a compound directly adjacent to the embassy building itself. And I've never seen security like that. I've been to the White House a couple of times, and it was on par with the White House. So the point being, why are we there at all? And how does the agency actually operate in an environment like that, where they're so afraid of something happening that they're basically living in a bunker? How do they get any sense of what's happening around them? And what I found as a journalist, I for the New York Times Magazine, I've covered a lot of conflicts. And what I've found time and time again is that, if I'm at a foreign capital and at a party or whatever, and American diplomats, including agency personnel, will start asking me what's happening in the countryside, because they're not allowed to go there by State Department rules and by agency rules. So I think in a lot of places around the world, the agency is really kind of stumbling around in the dark, and really don't have a clue what's going on.
Wow. Which doesn't exactly fill you with confidence that we've got a sense of what's going on in the world, which is a little bit scary. Okay, Karen asked, given the complexities of this material, how long did it take to write and publish this book?
It's a good question. I had started about 5 years ago, and I got sidetracked. I did a special project for the New York Times Magazine on basically the wars in the Middle East that stemmed from the Arab Spring, of the revolutions from 2011. And in typical writer fashion, I was deluded as how long this was going to take me. I thought it was going to be like a 6-month project, and it ended up being almost 2 years. And it took up an entire issue of the New York Times Magazine. So that's sidetracked. In between trips to the Middle East, I would be doing research. But it really wasn't until, I guess, the summer of 2016 that I started writing the book, actually doing the writing. So about 3 years of work on the book.
Okay. And then do you want to speak a little bit to the publishing process of when you sort of turn that in and how long that takes? Because a lot of folks think it's a lot quicker than it really is.
Right. No, I know it's, book publishing is quite the archaic business. I handed in the book in the summer of, God, I'm trying to remember now, about a year and a half ago, or a year and 3 months ago. And I thought that, it'll probably be a spring 2020 book. And I'm constantly kind of caught out. Now, you kind of need about a year between when the book is in pretty close to finished form. I mean, you haven't done copy edits and all the final stuff, but it's a very long process. Of course they can slam a book out if they want to, if a big event happens, and you're kind of chasing headlines. But a book that's they need time to sort of market it and figure out all that stuff. So it took a long time.
Yeah. I know how that goes.
Yeah.
Do you have, Leslie asked, do you have the sense that there are more secrets to be revealed from the Cold War?
It's yes, I do. And, I think one of the great potential secrets, I've never been a Kennedy assassination conspiracy theorist. But there is still some details around that assassination that still don't make sense. And I'm thinking specifically of Oswald's connections with the Soviet Union. And it's actually something I've been looking at fairly recently for potentially a new project. But if I'd heard somebody say that 6 months ago, I would have just thought, okay, another JFK conspiracy quack.
But it's 2020. Everything seems possible now.
Well, that's right. That's right. And I was just going to say that there's because of the congressional hearings in the JFK assassination in the 1990s, the vast majority, over 90% of all the CIA, all the FBI papers dealing with the assassination have been released. There was a small, about 10% was withheld until 2017. Those have now been released, but then there's another little small bunch of papers, and it all has to do with the Soviet potential connections to Oswald, and those are still being withheld. Yeah, here we are. How many decades later? So that's one, and I'm sure there's other ones to come out, other secrets to come out.
Right, right. Let's see. I think those are the questions we've got so far. Does anybody else have other questions to ask? I'm curious, you had the chance to interview someone, Peter, one of your subjects. That seems pretty remarkable for him to still be around and to share those first person stories with you. What are the, and I'm sure some of this is later on in the book too, but what kind of a sense did you take away from speaking with him on his thoughts? Does he still feel sort of disgusted by it all? Maybe that's too harsh of a word, or
yeah, he's extraordinarily smart man, and one of the things I was fascinated by, almost from just a personal psychological standpoint. His family were German Jews. He escaped from the Nazis twice, from Nazi Germany and then again in Vichy France. When his family took refuge in France, when the Germans invaded, they again were threatened to be sent to camps. They escaped through Spain and Portugal to the United States. So here's this guy who went through that experience, and now he's in Berlin in the 1940s and 50s, working with people, because the whole, the Americans were clueless about what was happening in Eastern Europe and Eastern Germany. So their eyes and ears on the ground were former German military intelligence people from the Nazi regime. And Peter's attitude was he said, they all want to have the conversation with me. The conversation being, I was one of the good Germans. I was never a Nazi. I hid Jews in my basement. And Peter said, I would just shut them off. I didn't want to hear it. And I said, look, I don't care what you did during the war. That's on your conscience. But now you have to be this way for me in this new battle we're fighting. So that's incredibly dispassionate outlook for somebody, for a Jew who looking at the end of the Holocaust. But what I definitely saw with Peter was this stuff became gradual. So immediately after the war, they're working with former German bureaucrats, because who else is going to run the country? Then you're working with former German military intelligence, because they're the only ones who knows what's happening behind the Iron Curtain. And now you're dealing with with former Nazi officials who were sitting behind desks. And then gradually you're going down and down, and now you need operatives in the field. So you're now dealing with men who actually committed war crimes out there. But I think with like a lot of our experiences in our daily lives, there's this gradualism that happens, and you're on this path, and you don't know when you reach the point where you say no more, or you're crossing a line that shouldn't be crossed. And I think that that part I found interesting with Peter. I think the other fascinating thing I saw with him was how he just reached a point where he just saw the utter futility of these operations, and it ate away at him. And another thing I should add, I probably should have added when I was talking, it's a huge effect on all these men, all four of them really, was the Red Scare that was happening back in the States at the same time, being perpetrated by J. Edgar Hoover and Joe McCarthy. And one of their primary targets was the CIA, because J. Edgar Hoover, at the end of World War II, he wanted the FBI to take over the entire international intelligence agency. And he was always trying to put the boot into the CIA. So any chance he got to investigate somebody. So, I mentioned Peter Sichel came under investigation. As soon as somebody in the FBI came across Peter Sichel's file and found people saying, why does he keep canceling his operations? They just went at him full bore. Frank Wisner was investigated by the FBI for almost his entire time in the CIA. Also, I should point out, these guys in the field, they tended to be politically liberal. Certainly, they were very socially liberal, well-educated. And they saw this carnival show happening back in the United States with the Red Scare and with McCarthy and Hoover, and were really disgusted by it, along with being victims of it. So I think that had a huge, and I talk about that quite a bit in the book. So I think that had a huge corrosive effect on these men and on their morale to keep fighting, to keep going.
Well, it must be so hard to be trying to serve your country that way and feel as though, you're not supported, which is a statement that can be applied to many, many things, surely. Right. But that's got to be hard. Okay, Paula asks, what was the fiasco at the Bay of Pigs in Cuba the result of the actions of the earlier OSS CIA actions?
Great question. The Bay of Pigs happens, of course, a bit after my book, but basically, I'll tell you that both the CIA coups first in Iran in 1953 and then Guatemala in 1954 had a huge influence on Bay of Pigs. There's this remarkable symmetry in Iran and Guatemala, where basically in both cases the governments were overthrown on kind of a massive bluff. In both places, the CIA had sort of done this rent-a-mob approach, that were agitating against the sitting president, Mossadegh in Iran, and I always forget Arbenz, in Guatemala. And in both cases, by day 2 of the attempted coup, everything had fallen apart. They had failed. The CIA was kind of trying to wrap up and get their people out of the country. And then in both cases, all of a sudden, the man they were trying to overthrow blinked and everything fell apart. So both of these successes, if you call them that, only they were disastrous in long term, but at the moment they were successes. They had this idea, they conveyed this idea to the CIA and to the American government in general. It's like, it's really cheap and easy to overthrow regimes abroad. In both cases, in Iran and Guatemala, it was done for lunch money. $200,000, I think they spent overthrowing the government in Guatemala. So carry on to 1961 and Cuba and the Bay of Pigs. I think there was this kind of institutional belief that, hey, it worked 2 other times. Let's do it another time. It'll work for us again. So again, kind of built on a bluff. More people involved who were just going to land on the beaches in Cuba, and its ideas they were going to spread out and kind of rally people to their side, but kind of also sort of built on a bluff. So yeah, you could absolutely see the tie between Guatemala and Iran and Cuba.
Okay. And Paula says, could that be happening here?
I'll answer it this way. I'm in touch with people in the agency, and the whole idea of there being this deep state. They always in the past. They always got this from kind of the left wing. It was a left wing conspiracy theory that there was this deep state, the Bilderberg group of the CIA and the FBI, and now all of a sudden it's the right wing, and it's being actively peddled by the president of this idea that there being this deep state that's seeking to unseat the president. No, I don't believe it. But what I'll say with the agency, people I've talked to, they're annoyed by all that talk of the deep state and that they're supposed to be a part of, but they're also, they're kind of big boys and girls, and they recognize its politics. What they are deeply concerned about and suspicious about is they see Russia, Vladimir Putin's Russia, as an inherently adversarial nation. They are not our friends. They are our enemies. not enemies, at least rivals. So they're deeply concerned and deeply suspicious as to why we have a president who seems to steadfastly refuse to see it that way. I don't know if I really answered the question directly, but yeah.
Well, I think that's, in your experience and your
Right.
qualifications, I think so. Yes, frightening indeed, Paula, I agree. And then let's see, if the CIA didn't learn any lessons from the years in your book, have they been as bumbling ever since? Or was there a time that they were competent besides the good luck of Iran, Guatemala? Or is that not possible to achieve in a spy agency? You guys have like these really like deep questions.
Yeah, no, I know.
Doing well for Wednesday in a pandemic.
You're working my brain here.
Yes.
Actually, it's a great thing. I'm really glad to get that question, because during the late 1940s and 1950s, along with these kind of covert operations that were going on, part of Frank Wisner's, what he nicknamed the Mighty Wurlitzer, there was also this massive covert campaign to fund culture throughout Europe. And it was funneled through the State Department, but the CIA, but it was in fact, it was a CIA operation. They built these massive overseas library programs. They're all through Western Europe, through Germany. You had these huge libraries that were open to the public. They sponsored Broadway shows. They sponsored readings by Langston Hughes. They brought over Tennessee Williams, and it was this whole kind of hearts and minds approach to basically to show the so-called American way of life, but to kind of show that instead of this, people having to live in straitjackets of artistic expression in the Soviet Union, in the United States and in the Western side, you had freedom of expression. And also, kind of adjacent to that, they were also doing Radio Free Europe. It was kind of propaganda light. Of course, the news broadcasts were slanted towards the pro-Western view, but it was, not to the degree a lot of people might think. It was pretty open. So the Radio Free Europe became by far the most listened to radio station throughout Eastern Europe. And so you really have this great irony where the black operations the CIA was carrying out at this time, the infiltration operations, which were almost complete fiascos. These kind of white operations they were running on a cultural level were hugely successful, and really did create this kind of very benevolent view of the United States in Europe. All those programs, not Radio Free Europe, but the Overseas Library Program, these cultural exchange programs, they were all shut down during the Red Scare, because Joe McCarthy comes along and says that these are boondoggles and they're communist fronts. So all those programs pretty much got scrapped. But interesting that Frank Wisner, kind of by the mid-1950s, he was recognizing that Radio Free Europe and Voice of America, which is another CIA operation going into Russia or Soviet Union, they were probably the most successful operations he ran. And no one got killed.
Right.
Yeah.
That's our measure of success, I suppose. That's one. That's one benchmark. But that is really, really fascinating. I have often bemoaned that because of my age, when usually our school year history ended with World War II.
Right.
And I think that hopefully that is slightly different now, but I didn't get to learn very much about the times after that. And I find all of this very, very fascinating. So thank you so much for sharing all of that. Those were some great questions from our attendees. Again, you guys have a better Wednesday pandemic brain than I do. But I think we all have a lot to think about. I mean, this is really, it's amazing how relevant it all still is, despite being 60 plus years ago. So thank you so much for that. It looks like we've got everybody says great thoughts, great answers, great job. So interesting. Thank you so much. Yes, it's good to learn things again.
Well, thank you. Thanks very much for having me on, Jenny. I appreciate it.
Oh, we very much appreciate it. Just let everybody know we are working on getting your books, the signed books, ready and available for you. So please wait to hear from us, and we'll ship those out or have those available for pickup for those of you who purchase books as soon as those are ready. So shipping times are very fun right now, as you can all imagine. So thank you for your patience. But we're very glad to have all of you here. Scott, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much. We hope that when, as you're working on something else, the next book, perhaps you could share a little bit about before we go?
Would love to. Yeah, would love to.
All right. Well, next time when their next book, we will love to have you hopefully in person. So everybody stay safe, be well, and we hope to see you soon in some way.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Good night.
Night.